and Jerry's kind of touched on it, that on the one hand, he's absolutely right about the research. I don't think there's a person out there who can't point to a pile of studies, all of which confirms the reality that the best bang for the incremental dollar invested is in those early years. But having said that, we discovered in the last part of the Peterson administration, when we indicated that we were going to require school boards to offer junior kindergarten, I'll tell you, I was surprised as the minister at the time of just what kind of resistance there was on what appeared to me non-pedagogical grounds, but it was more a values question, the role of the state as opposed to the role of the family. So there was in this area, there was a legitimate debate.
So I mean, and let's be clear here. I mean, what Premier Harris was talking about, and what you were talking about, Jerry, was respecting parental choice, supporting that, and recognizing the different circumstances that many of our communities are in. But the other thing to remember from the parent's perspective is you take a system that for many reasons was not meeting the needs of parents or students or teachers back then, for lots of reasons. But the kids were not coming out with what they needed at the end of school. That's what this was all about. And you then say to that parent, you know, this system that's failing your kid from kindergarten to grade 13, we want you to send your child there from 2 to 3. And not surprisingly, a few parents said, just a minute. So I think that it's important, but let's not underestimate.
The debate was a little different than that.
Well, no, but that was part of it, Dave. And let's not underestimate the value of what was done.
The government would offer the programs, first of all, but I agree. I remember canvassing in 1995, and in my riding, especially in the suburban part of it in particular, the two things that came up was, you guys, your deficits are way too huge. We're not going to re-elect you. And what's this thing that the government wants to take over our parenting responsibilities?
Let me put another issue on the table, Jerry, and this was one of the recommendations that I think raised a lot of eyebrows and then disappeared very quickly and has not been acted upon. You recommended I think you did anyway, the creation of schools exclusively for African Canadian kids. What was behind that recommendation?
Well, it's a completely different and specialized subject. It was, I was going to say a moment in time, but maybe the moment is lasting a long time, when there have been concerns about the school success of certain demographic communities in Ontario, and everybody knows one of them were black kids. And we had remarkable debates, I must say, within about this issue. Here were a bunch of people, Monique as a small L as well as large L liberal, and Dennis Murphy and Avis herself, who was a Jamaican, who all our life, all of us had fought for and believed in bringing a community together, and here we were faced with a proposition that may be separating them because blacks seem not to be doing okay in the regular school system, maybe separating them made best sense. And we had long, agonizing, really difficult and fascinating conversations about it, and at the end, frankly, it was close to a flip of the coin. We didn't know what was the best way to go, and we knew it would be controversial, and our PR person said, you're going to destroy yourself, this is going to be the issue that the media is going to latch on to. Well, it didn't happen, and the whole thing faded.
It didn't happen. Why didn't those schools get created, Dave Cook, when you looked at the recommendation?
Well, it was certainly, it didn't dominate the reaction to the Royal Commission. It certainly, in every scrum that I did, was one of the first questions that came up. And quite frankly, I made a decision right off the bat that just wasn't going to allow this to take over debate, and said, we're not going with it.
So it was more a political calculation than anything.
It was a political calculation. I mean, I think there are arguments that can be made, whether you're called an alternative school, a black focus school. I believe in Toronto, there's a school for First Nation students that's run by the Toronto District School Board, and you could call that a First Nation focused school. So there may in fact be some educational arguments. There are some educational arguments in favor of the recommendation, but I think Jerry's right that these types of things have a possibility of hijacking the debate.
Let me get one more topic in this section, and that is, Janet, I'll go to you first on this. Student codes of conduct. Where are we on that today? Because he recommended it. Where is it at today?
Well, it was an excellent recommendation. We put in a student code of conduct, and we also put in the Safe Schools Act legislation that gave, first of all, set out clear expectations, not only for student behavior, but also for the expectations of teachers. I mean, it's a mutual, and parents. It's a mutual, if you will, expectation, obligation to each other. The legislation also gave principals and teachers authority that we felt they needed in the classroom, in the school. They're the ones that know best what the situation information is and what happens.
Do you think it's working?
I think it has the potential. We asked school boards to keep data on it so that we could judge and see how well it did work. And I think the current government, I asked, I think it was on this show before, I hope they move forward with it because it responded very carefully to what we were told needed to happen in schools. But it also, too, the other important thing is that it set clear rules. If you bring weapons to school, and there was a debate about kids are bringing weapons to school. Well, we said they should be expelled and go into strict discipline schooling that gives them what they need. You don't just put them in the local mall. That doesn't work. But you put them into a schooling program that helps them earn their way back into the school, but also make sure that weapons are not in those classrooms.
Okay, this brings to the end section 1 of 3 that we're going to get to. Just a reminder, those of you watching at home, it's a special hour-long edition of Fourth Reading on this, the 10th anniversary of the Royal Commission on Learning's landmark report. Let's continue our analysis of whether Ontario's education system is really any better today by examining what the Royal Commissioners called school community alliances. 10 years ago, parents were complaining that the school system seemed too remote, too complex, too ineffective, and too inaccessible. And as a result, after listening to parents, the Royal Commissioners recommended a host of changes to everything, including revamping the curriculum, which many thought was way too weak, mandatory literacy tests to better gauge the progress of students, creating a provincial report card so parents had a clearer sense of what their children were really achieving, mandatory school councils giving parents and other community members a much more direct pipeline into their schools, and finally, a recommendation that people other than certified teachers be allowed into the classroom as instructors. Well, as you might imagine, mandatory literacy testing captured a great deal of attention. It was seen as both an essential tool by many to determine whether students were progressing, and no doubt also a bit daunting to students who now had to take the tests and teachers who had to make sure their kids passed them. A few months ago, we took our cameras to Courcelette Public School in the south end of Toronto, a school where 100% of the children performed at or above the provincial standard for reading, writing, and mathematics. Here's how they did it.
Dear Robert Munch, comma, notice how they indented? I have almost all your books, and I think they are all wonderful. I think your best book was Stephanie. What I'd like to do is just show them examples of work that, so that they can show themselves what they want to do and how much they can push themselves. So if they know that their work looks like a level 1, that they know that they should be adding a little bit more detail so they can sort of do some self-assessment.
Well, the main method is what you saw in Miss Bauer's classroom today, which is direct teaching. And what that means is that the teacher doesn't leave anything to chance in how they're getting the message across to the student. And while they're getting the message across to the student, they're always checking for understanding. Many people believe that children will just pick up things that you don't really have to directly teach them, and that's not true. Children need the direct methods of a teacher in front of them. They need a quiet place to work and learn, and they need time on task, and that's a really important thing, that there aren't unnecessary interruptions. The kids, once they come in, they're focused on what they're doing, and so the learning happens.
A gentle tap on the shoulder woke her. She looked up and smiled at the broom, not a ghost at all, but still covered with a coat of white paint that she'd given it. There's a lot of misconceptions that they have, so we do a lot of talking about it, like, am I still going to pass grade 3 if I don't pass EQAO? So it's just sort of alleviating those fears and not really talking about it, so then by the time EQAO happens, they're prepared enough, but they haven't really realized that, all of this work ahead of time it's not just going to the test, it's things that are on the curriculum for grade 3 anyway. So it's a lot of assessment along the way, and just checking that they're getting it as you go so that, you're not full of surprises in May.
Let's continue our discussion with, he's already anxious to get into it, there's Jerry Kaplan, the former co-chair of the Royal Commission on Learning, our 3 former education ministers, Dave Cook, Janet Ecker, and Sean Conway, and we're now joined by Annie Kidder from People for Education. Over the past 10 years, Annie has become one of this province's best known and most committed gadflies on the education scene. Gadflies, that's a good word, eh? Good word. Jerry, those tests, what was the thinking behind them?
We were very, very ambivalent. There was no consensus, let's go back to that. There was a whole group of people who were pretty happy with the school system, and in my view, they were not wrong. I thought the school system, given the obligations it had, was doing really remarkably well. I thought all the extreme criticisms of it were baloney, and I thought the group of parents who had gotten together as a kind of coherent conservative opposition were mostly out to lunch. I thought their criticisms were significantly exaggerated. Didn't know what they wanted. Yes, I did. They wanted a different school system. They virtually didn't want a public school system.
Having said that,
no. First of all, we needed to compromise. I mean, all commissions are political, otherwise they'll be ignored, and we talked about that quite openly. If we just ignored all these people, we'd be dismissed, and we didn't want to do that. We worked too hard. Secondly, we thought that in some cases, some kind of overall testing proposals made some sense. It made some sense to know whether the people in Toronto and the people in Thunder Bay were being taught by the same standards, whether the results indicated that teachers were doing the same kind of job. That seemed to make some sense. And so we wanted a few more tests. We wanted people who were having trouble to be tested in order to be remediated. The notion of tests for themselves, the kind of thing that had been sweeping the United States for 10 years, we thought was anathema, we thought was waste, we thought was probably some kind of corporate conspiracy to make billions of dollars, and in the States it was that. And so we introduced some modest forms of testing, which I thought Dave Cook, the NDP minister, thought was too modest, and which I know that the Conservatives, when they came in, thought was far too modest.
More on that in a second. 10 years after this recommendation, Annie, how do you think tests have done in the school system?
Well, I think that the where we really go wrong with tests is the idea that tests somehow improve the school system. They don't make anything better. I'm not one of those people that just hates tests and thinks they're, inherently evil. But I think that it's important what we use them for, and that's where we go wrong, that we just test them and that's the end of the story.
What was your concern about what they'd be used for?
Well, I think that what's important is that we use them in order to make things better, that we use them. I don't think we need to be testing every single kid in the province in the many grades that we do right now, that you could actually test. You could test in some areas, you could be testing for some subjects. I worry that by only testing the things we test in math, only testing basically literacy and numeracy, we create a kind of two-tier curriculum. We say this is important, thus history is not important, geography is not important, science is not important, the arts aren't important, that you end up sort of putting all your eggs in that basket. And that what's important is that when we're looking at at the results of these tests, that we understand that they're a measure of a very general kind of aspect of how we're doing in teaching the curriculum, and that if we see, okay, maybe we could do a little better in area X or area Y, we do that, but that it's such an easy thing for the public and for parents to latch on to, that we all get kind of obsessed with whether or not we're reaching, level 3 or whatever the level, and you can change the levels.
Let me put that to Janet. I guess the criticism of your government was that you guys were just way too gung-ho on testing, and that you somehow it was manna from heaven for Conservatives who wanted to change the education system in a dramatic way, to which you would say what?
First of all, parents that wanted to have testing and wanted to know how well their kids are doing, I would disagree with Jerry sort of dissing their views as somehow they were conservative, therefore it wasn't a good thing. No one was advocating tests, at least in Ontario, and I will defer to expertise in other jurisdictions here, but no one was advocating tests for the sake of tests. Annie's quite right. You test so you know how well they're doing, so you can then go out and fix the problems that you have. And that was the whole point around the steps that were taken. You had the new curriculum that focused on literacy and numeracy, and I also agree that's not where you stop, but it is where you start, literacy and numeracy. We then brought in you had the EQAO testing to put that, to measure how well kids are learning. Sorry, Education Quality and Accountability Office. You could have come up with a simpler name, but anyway. We then put in strategies, the early reading program that we brought in, where we said to schools, and we invested in early reading programs, the kinds of things you showed in your the opener, where you focus on teaching kids, making sure from kindergarten to grade 3 that they have those literacy skills that they need.
Has the province gone too gung-ho in testing as a result of this recommendation?
Well, I don't think so, and I would argue in 2 ways. One is that I do think every student in the particular grade should be part of it, because politically, parents would not stand for their kids not to be part of these tests.
You're not saying politics was at the root of some of this.
I think that if a good public education system is not only solid in terms of its education principles, but also in responding to the public as well. But I think this area has probably had more impact on public education than anything else.
How so?
I go to conferences now, I go into schools, and I see that the teachers and their staff are taking a look at the data and they're saying, now here's our strengths, here's our weaknesses, what do we need to do?